Hello, Ahorja. Welcome to Stories, Legends and Wonders of Aran. Aran is also known as Inishmore, the largest of the three Aran Islands. I'm Dara Malloy, Dara Ómé Lia Ascailge.
Today I'm going to bring you to see Teampall and its surroundings. And I'm standing here to begin with at the gate into the Holy Well, which is a separate video I have made. So just to give you your bearings, we start at the gate to the Holy Well and we start walking up then the lane here, up the track towards Teampall, the Church of St. Ciaran. I'm sitting up here on the stile, which was one way to get into the church across the wall if you're nimble and young maybe. There's also a gate on my right here which will bring you around the back of the church. So whichever you choose suits you. But first of all, just to tell you a little bit about St. Ciaran. St. Ciaran was a young monk who came here probably in the 6th century, probably the second generation of monks to come out to the island. And he was typical of many of the young monks at the time. There were young men, there were also young women at that time who came out here wanting to dedicate their life to something very different from what had been in Ireland up to that point. They were dedicating their lives to follow in a way the inspiration of the monks of Egypt and also the monks of Syria, and they were hermits. So this island, had been chosen by St. Enda because of its remoteness and because of its barrenness. It's mostly dry stone. There's very little grass or trees here. And it was the next best thing to the deserts of Egypt, which was the inspiration for this type of lifestyle. And every young monk who came here was learning to live that lifestyle. And they had found that St. Enda was probably the best teacher of that lifestyle. So they came out here in their droves at this time, especially the 6th and 7th century, to learn from Enda. So Ciaran was one of these young men who came out here. Probably Enda said to him, come over to this part of the island and build yourself a little hermit hut here and see if you can attract a few disciples to live with you and try to model yourself on Jesus and the 12 apostles. So see if you can gather up maybe 12 little disciples, young disciples to be with you, and build yourself a little monastic community of hermits. And that's apparently what Ciaran did. He seems to have been very successful. He lived here for 7 years, and in his 7th year, he had a dream one night, which was very, very strong. He woke up with it in his head, and he went to somebody who would maybe help him to interpret the dream. And the dream was that he saw himself in the dream in the middle of Ireland. And there was a big, big tree growing right beside a river or a stream. And the tree had lots of fruit on it. And when he looked up at the tree, there were birds gathering from all the 4 corners of the earth to take the fruit and take it away in their mouths. And with the interpreter helping him, he figured out that's where he had to go in his life. That was going to be, if you like, his place of resurrection. This dream revealed the rest of his life to him. And he left here and went to a place which is now called Clonmacnoise on the River Shannon. So the River Shannon was the river or stream he saw in his dream. And the tree he saw in his dream was the monastery that he created there, which indeed became one of the most famous monasteries in the whole country. When Pope John Paul II visited here at the end of the 70s, that was the one monastic site in Ireland that he visited. He had many, many choices, but that's the one he visited. So that's the background to Ciaran. While he was here for the 7 years, he apparently took responsibility for the corn, for growing the corn, which would mean planting and reaping, threshing the corn, taking away the seed, using the stalks for probably thatching, for making beehives, because they were made out of straw in those days. So he was in charge of all of that, and maybe he was a thatcher as well himself. But that's the background to him, and I feel that his gentle, creative, humble spirit is still present in this site. When you come in to visit it, you get a sense of his gentleness and his kindness here. And his monastic community stayed on here for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, the last monk to leave here was during the time of the Reformation in the 16th century. So the monastery was a Celtic monastery, probably right up to the 12th century, and then it was taken over by possibly canons of St. Augustine or some other European religious order which came in with a Norman invasion in the 12th century. And then it continued on as a monastery here right up to the Reformation. So in the last 400 or 500 years, we haven't had any monastic community living here. But that's the background. So I'll bring you into the church now and we'll have a look inside. So I'm showing you here the oldest door of the church. This part of the church is 8th century, which makes it about 200 years after the time that Ciaran lived here. Perhaps when Ciaran built his church, he built it with something that didn't last, like wood or clay and wattle or something like that. And they only started building stone churches a few hundred years later. But even then, when they built their stone churches, they built them very small because their idea of a monastic community was 12 monks and an abbot or an abbess. So they weren't looking for a huge big church like they had all across Europe. They were looking for something just to house 13 people. So if you look carefully at that gable wall, you can perhaps see the line in it of the earlier gable, which was much smaller. It was only about the width of my outstretched arms. And the church would have only come out a few metres, maybe 3 or 4 metres. So a little small church, big enough just to hold 13 monks standing up. And they didn't gather in the church very often, you know. They might have gathered just once a week on the Sabbath, which in those days was a Saturday. Rome eventually changed it to a Sunday, but the Sabbath for the Jews was a Saturday, and it became the Sabbath for the Christians then in the early centuries as well. So they gathered once a week for the Eucharist, and that meant consecrating a loaf of bread, which they had made themselves, and each monk took a chunk of the bread, put it into a satchel, which hung around the monk's neck. It was a leather satchel that they had made, and you carried that bread with you, that sacred host with you, if you like, right through the week. And when you're out working, you took the satchel off your neck and hung it maybe on a branch or a tree or something like that. And it sort of reminded you of the presence of the divine in your midst throughout the day's work. And then in the evening time, when you went back to your cell, you brought it with you and you hung it inside in your cell. And again, even the divine presence was there while you slept. So that's a lovely idea of always trying to be aware of the presence of the divine in your midst at all times. The church then, over the centuries, grew bigger and bigger as the influence of Rome came in, until eventually it got to the size where you see it today. But that's in the 16th century, and at that stage the church in Ireland was completely Romanised. Now we've come out of the church on the west side, facing west, and I want to show you this wonderful standing stone here. The stone is possibly 8 or 9 feet high. It has some carvings on it which are Christian symbols like a cross. But my theory is that the stone was placed here long before the Celtic monks arrived, long before St. Ciaran. Because you have to realise that people lived here on the Aran Islands for up to 5,000 years. And the Christians only came in the last 2,000 years. So for 3,000 years, the place was occupied by people whose spiritual leaders were the Druids. And the Druids never built a church or a temple because they saw the divine presence in the trees and in the sea and in the sun and in the wind, in all of the environment around them. And the only time they would mark the landscape was when they wanted to mark a particular place, maybe for sacred purposes. And sometimes they used a standing stone to do that. We have the most famous standing stone in Ireland on the hill of Tara, called the Leafoil, the stone of destiny, which was used to identify who would be the next king of Ireland. But other stones were placed into the ground in order to mark a sacred energy point. And that's what I find interesting about here, because we've had a number of groups of people come here. One was a German group and the other was an Irish group, and they were either using pendulums, you know, the way they swing really fast in a clockwise direction if they're picking up energy under the ground, and others were using divining rods in their hands. And both groups identified this stone as marking the center point of the energy of this whole location. I call this location a sacred landscape. It's always been used for sacred purposes, not just by the monks in Christian times, but by the Druids in the thousands of years prior to Christianity. And this stone, I believe, marks the center point of the energy of this place. So if you put your hands on the stone, you're in touch with some great positive energy of the earth. In fact, the stone can represent a connection between the earth itself and the sky. And the earth would represent the feminine sacred energy of Mother Earth herself. So you're connecting into all that energy that gives life to the plants, to the trees, to the flowers, to the birds, to everything that comes out of the ground. And the sky represents other energies, the masculine energies, the sacred masculine, which comes down from on high, represented by the sun, the god Lu represented the sun, but there are other gods that are connected with the sky, with thunder and lightning and so on, and they're all above us, and they're the sacred masculine energy. And this stone here connects the two. So I often in my ceremonies here, especially in a wedding ceremony, I invite the man who's getting married to put his hands on the stone and seek a blessing for the role he's taking on as a husband for his beloved. So I'm going to do that now. I've brought you now round to the east gable of the church. If you ever get lost on the Aran Islands, just find a Celtic church and it'll tell you where the east and the west and the north and the south are, because it's always oriented towards the east. If you go into the church, the altar is always underneath a window that faces east. That's because it wants to catch the rising sun in the morning, which proclaims the resurrection of Christ. And you know, when a cockerel crows here in the Aran Islands in the morning, at dawn, we think it says cock-a-doodle-doo because we speak English, but if you speak Gaeilge, as we do here on the island, the cockerel says Tá mac na hóige slán. Can you hear it? Tá mac na hóige slán, which means the Son of the Virgin is alive, which is the proclamation that the cockerel crowed to Peter. You remember that story in the Bible, in the Gospels, where Peter betrays Jesus 3 times. So it's that wonderful story being contained in the very lifestyle of the people here. They see the reflection of the gospel and of their spiritual beliefs in everything around them, in the holy well, in the church, in the tree, some of the trees, in the cockerel crowing in the morning, in the various seasons of the year. And it's a lovely way to live, to have that sense of the spiritual in your life every day of every part of the year. But to get back now to this is the sundial that's on the east gable of St. Kieran's Church. And it has the dial here, below a hole in the stone, and below that again a beautiful Celtic cross. So the hole in the stone is designed to put a stick into, and the stick then catches the light of the sun going across the sky during the day, and the shadow from the sun and the stick moves across the dial, which probably was painted various colours. And one monk here was in charge of the bell, and he had to ring the bell on the 7 times in the day when the monks were called to prayer. And here's something that we can translate into today, because we're all very tied up in our phones. We never lose a minute, or if there's any minutes or spare, we're taking the phone out and looking at what's on it. We never take a break. This practice 7 times a day invites you to stop 7 times a day and do nothing. Don't be looking at your phone. Just rest, just center yourself, perhaps look at a butterfly or admire a flower, or maybe you have some music in the background, or just look at the sea, the tide, the waves rolling in and out. Something in nature that brings you to a place beyond yourself, that connects you with the greater mystery of the world, that puts you into a mystical space and gets you centered and focused. And then you'll be better able to deal with all the distractions that life throws at you for the rest of the day. I think it's a great practice, if only we could get ourselves to do it. This stone was used for a practical purpose, for the monk to know the time of the day, to ring the bell, call the monks to prayer, wherever they happen to be, on a boat fishing, or down on the shore collecting shellfish or seaweed, or up on a roof putting thatch on a building, or whatever it was they were doing. They just stopped wherever they were and they prayed in whatever way that was meaningful to them to pray. Since the monks left here 500 years ago or so, the local people here have continued to use the stone even to this day. We use it particularly as a wishing stone, and people come here all through the year, but especially on the 9th of September, which is the feast day of St. Ciaran. And they pray at the well, they pray in the church, and then they make a wish at the standing stone. It's a wishing stone. And you bring with you in your pocket, as I have here, a silk scarf. And to make your wish, you pull the silk scarf through the hole. And you do that 3 times. And that's how you make your wish. So on the 3rd time, you pull it through, hold it there, close your eyes, make your wish. So when I do weddings here, as I regularly do, one of the little rituals we can perform in the wedding ceremony is for the couple to stand either side, pull the scarf through to one another, and on their 3rd pull through, make a wish for their future. It's a lovely thing to do. And we can also use the stone for the married couple to confirm their vows. So they have made their vows during the course of the ceremony, and here they can confirm them or solemnize them. This stone was used also not just as a wishing stone, but as a contract stone. And there were many contract stones around Ireland. And again, they had to have a hole in them. And the way you made a contract with somebody was each person in the contract deal stood either side of the stone. And when you were ready, when you agreed all the details of the agreement, buying a piece of land, selling a cow, maybe offering your son or your daughter in marriage, as happened up to recently here on this island, the whole family would be involved in the marriage, if you like, and in consenting to the marriage, because it involved change of ownership of land and sharing of land and stuff like that. It was a very serious thing for 2 people to get married, both from the island. So the contract would be usually confirmed by the parents, but in our case today, it can be confirmed by the couple themselves. So say the bride stands on this side, she puts the first finger of her right hand in the hole, and then the groom stands this side, and he puts his first finger of his right hand in the hole, and when the 2 fingers touch in the middle, that's the wedding vows confirmed. So it's a lovely idea. Now let me show you all around the outside of this monastic site to show you how extensive the sacred landscape is. So if you look over the walls there into the next field, you can see another standing stone. And it's not quite the same as the one that I have shown you here, the one with all the energy beneath it, but it's probably marking the boundary of the monastery. And then if you come down here, you'll see another stone sticking up out of the ground. I don't know if you can see it there. Another one in that field. Now, there's no knowing if these are the original locations of the stones or if farmers have moved them so that the cattle can scratch up against the side of them. If you move around again, and directly in front of us here, down at the field nearest the sea, you'll see there a graveyard. You can see stones sticking up out of the ground and one fairly large grave, one flat stone on the top of it. That's called Relic Nalani. It's the graveyard of the children. And it's there because of the church teaching, the Roman church teaching, which the Celtic church disagreed with, I have to say, of original sin. This really was a teaching that emerged from St. Augustine, and Augustine taught that when a child was conceived through the sexual act of his parents, the child inherited the sin of Adam and Eve into that child's life, and that's original sin, and therefore the child couldn't go to heaven unless it was absolved of the sin, and the only way to absolve it was to be baptized into the church. So in my view, it was a trick, it was a political trick to get everybody to become members of the church at a very early age. But it caused horrible consequences for people here in Ireland, because they believed it literally, and when a child died, maybe at birth and before it was baptized, the parents felt ashamed, and they had let the child down because the child now wasn't going to go to heaven, and it wasn't going to go to hell either, it was going to limbo. And so it had to be buried in a special graveyard, not a consecrated one. And so they came down here often in the evening time and buried the child on their own with a shovel or a spade, and they just put a stone on top of the grave. So no proper gravestone. Now since then, I think the church has softened its position, and certainly the locals here have put pressure on the church to consecrate the graves of these children. And there's a mass said here every year now by the local parish priest, and the locals themselves keep the place tidy and clean. So at least some honour is being given to those children now. But yes, that's a very ancient controversy between the Celtic and the Roman Church. And the leader of the Celtic Church at the time of St. Augustine was Pelagius, who walked all the way from somewhere around the Celtic lands, maybe Ireland, maybe Wales, all the way to Rome, and eventually to some of the other major Christian cities as well, confronting that teaching. And he almost won. We almost became a church without the teaching of original sin being dominant. But eventually he was condemned, and his books were burnt, and he was put into exile. But the Celtic Church itself remained Pelagian, as they call it, so in favour of Pelagius' version of Christianity, which said there was no such thing as original sin.
These stories and all the other stories that are to be found on the Aran Islands can be found in my book Pocket Guide to Aran, Legends in the Landscape, and that's available from our website www.ashlingpublications.com, with Aisling spelt AISLING, so ashlingpublications.com. There's one other book there on your screen, The Globalization of God, Celtic Christianity's Nemesis, which was my first book that I wrote apart from the Pocket Guide. I wrote the Pocket Guide a long time before it. But this was, if you like, my first, more intellectual, more academic type book. It's a study of history, really, and an interpretation of history to show how Christianity really emerged from Judaism, and how Christianity took on the idea of becoming a global church. To do that, it had to sort of be based in Rome as its sort of centre, with the Pope becoming, if you like, the CEO of the organisation, and equating himself to the Emperor of Rome, and the whole thing then became a very authoritarian structure. And as that version of Christianity spread throughout the world, especially on the back of colonisation, which was the main way of spreading it, so it was spread by violence and by a lot of destruction and a lot of removal of indigenous spiritualities. That was the downside of it, that all the indigenous ways of, if you like, discovering the divine in their lives and expressing that in their mythology and in their sacred practices were all wiped out, which was such a shame. It was a destruction of diversity. And I suppose the book focuses on one of those indigenous ways of practicing Christianity, which was the Celtic Christian tradition, a tradition steeped in its own Celtic spiritual background, which had many gods and goddesses. So a very different form of Christianity. So part of this storytelling that I call the globalization of God is the story of the wiping out of Celtic Christianity. It happened first where it had spread throughout Europe and in Britain, and it happened then much later back in Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire, so it took longer to subject that to Rome, but it did in the end with the Norman invasion of Ireland in the 12th century. So if you're interested in history, you might like that book too.